My husband told me not to embarrass him at the military gala. He said I was only there as his wife. 2 hours later, a 4-star general walked across the ballroom, stopped in front of our table, and saluted me. My husband's smile disappeared. His mother dropped her fork. And for the first time in 3 years, every person in that room learned the truth about who I had been before I became Mrs. Ellison. That morning, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Ellison stood in front of our bedroom mirror, adjusting his dress uniform like the entire evening had already been designed around him. He did not look at me when he said it. He only tightened his cufflinks, lifted his chin, and spoke as if he were giving an order to someone beneath him. "Grace, tonight is important. Please remember you're only here as my wife." I stood behind him in a navy dress I had ironed twice, holding the small silver clutch he had told me was appropriate, and for a few seconds, I did not answer. Not because I did not understand him, because I understood him too well. For 3 years, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Ellison had introduced me as quiet, simple, supportive Grace, the woman who packed his garment bags, the woman who smiled beside him at formal dinners, the woman who did not correct his mother when she said I had finally done something useful by marrying a man in uniform. But before I was Grace Ellison, I had been Captain Grace Holloway. And before Mark ever wore the oak leaves on his shoulders, I had stood in a field hospital outside Kandahar with blood on both sleeves, a radio pressed to my ear, and 37 people depending on my voice to get them home alive. I looked at my husband in the mirror. "What exactly are you afraid I'll embarrass you with?" I asked. His reflection finally met my eyes. "Don't start," he said. "My promotion board is attending. General Whitmore will be there. Major Callahan will be there. These people matter." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because General Samuel Whitmore was the reason I still kept a folded flag in a cedar box under our bed. Mark did not know that. He knew I had served. Everyone knew that in the most shallow way possible. My military history was something he allowed people to mention only when it made him look noble for marrying a woman with a little discipline. He did not know the details. He had never asked. When we first met at a Veterans Scholarship fundraiser, I was already trying to leave my old life behind. I had returned from my final deployment with a limp that came and went in cold weather, a permanent ringing in my left ear, and a silence inside me that made crowds feel like storms. Mark was charming then, confident, proud in a way that seemed harmless at first. He told me he admired women who served. He said he understood sacrifice. He said I deserved peace. I believed him. Maybe I wanted to. I was tired of being known as the woman who kept calm while mortar fire walked closer. I was tired of rooms changing when people learned what I had done, who I had carried, who I had lost. So when Mark's family assumed I had been a clerk, or an assistant, or one of those morale officers, I let them. When his mother, Patricia, asked if I had mostly handled paperwork, I said, "Something like that." When his father, Robert, joked that at least the Army taught me how to fold napkins properly, I smiled and passed the potatoes. And when Mark began turning my silence into a stage for his own importance, I told myself a marriage required patience. But patience is not the same as surrender. The gala was held at the Grand Meridian Hotel downtown, in a ballroom with gold chandeliers, polished marble floors, and a wall of windows overlooking the river. It was an annual military charity dinner, the kind where wealthy donors wore small flag pins and officers wore uniforms sharp enough to cut glass. Mark wanted that room badly. For weeks, he had spoken about it like a battlefield. Who would sit where? Which general might stop by? Which donors mattered? Which spouses had influence? which handshakes could become assignments, recommendations, doors. He had practiced stories in the car. Not stories about missions. Stories about himself. He had already told me which version of his life to support if asked. He wanted me to say he was humble, strategic, respected, a natural leader. He wanted me to laugh softly at his jokes, touch his sleeve when appropriate, and avoid discussing my own service because, as he put it, tonight isn't about your past. By the time we reached the hotel entrance, my hands were cold. Mark noticed, but not with concern. "Relax," he said. "Just follow my lead." Inside the ballroom, his parents were already waiting near the registration table. Patricia Ellison wore pearls and a pale blue dress. Her silver hair swept into a perfect twist. Robert stood beside her with his veteran lapel pin displayed proudly, though he had served only 2 quiet years stateside decades earlier and had turned those years into a personality. Patricia looked me up and down. "Grace?" she said. "Very simple. Good. We didn't want anything distracting tonight." "Hello, Patricia," I said. Robert chuckled. "Mark, your girl cleans up nice. Good thing she doesn't have to wear combat boots to everything." Mark laughed. I did not. A younger officer's wife standing nearby glanced at me, uncomfortable, but said nothing. People rarely do when cruelty is wrapped in a joke. We moved through the reception line. Mark shook hands, smiled, placed his palm lightly on my lower back as if positioning me. Every time someone asked about me, he answered before I could. "This is my wife, Grace. She's very supportive. She keeps me grounded. She served a little before we married." A little. That phrase landed each time like a pebble dropped into deep water. Served a little. I remembered Lieutenant Maria Torres whispering her daughter's name while I pressed gauze into her shoulder. I remembered Specialist Owen Bell refusing morphine until the younger medic was treated first. I remembered carrying a letter in my breast pocket for a man who made me promise his mother would get it if he did not make it home. Served a little. At our assigned table, Patricia leaned toward the wife of Colonel Reeves and said, loudly enough for me to hear, "Grace is wonderfully quiet. Some military women make their service their whole identity, but she knows how to support a real officer." The fork in my hand paused above the salad. Mark gave me a warning look. I lowered the fork. Across the table, Major Daniel Callahan, a square-jawed man with a polished smile, lifted his glass toward Mark. "Big night," he said. "Heard Whitmore might be looking at names for the Regional Command Advisory Board." Mark's face brightened. "That's the hope," he said. Callahan's eyes shifted to me. "And Mrs. Ellison, were you Army too?" I opened my mouth. Mark answered. "Briefly," he said. "Administrative side, mostly." The room seemed to narrow around me. "Administrative side." I felt the old scar along my ribs tighten. Callahan nodded without interest. "Still, must be nice to understand the lifestyle." Patricia smiled. "Grace understands enough, but Mark is the real career officer in the family." That was when something inside me finally went still. Not angry. Not loud. Still. The kind of still I used to feel before the worst moments, when panic became useless and every sense sharpened. I looked at my husband. He was laughing with Callahan, already moving on, already comfortable with the lie. He had not simply let his family misunderstand me. He had edited me. He had taken years of my life and reduced them to a decorative background. Halfway through dinner, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor tonight to introduce a man whose service and leadership need no embellishment, General Samuel Whitmore. The ballroom rose in applause. I remained seated for one extra second because my knees had locked. Then I stood. General Whitmore walked to the podium with slower steps than I remembered. His hair had gone fully white. His shoulders were still straight, but time had softened the hard edges of him. He wore his dress uniform with the weight of someone who had earned every mark on it and wished fewer people had needed to pay the price. The last time I'd seen him in person, he had been on a stretcher, half-conscious, refusing evacuation until his men were accounted for. I had been the one on the radio. I had been the one who argued with command. I had been the one who disobeyed a retreat order long enough to keep the evacuation corridor open. And he had been the one who took my hand 2 weeks later in a hospital in Germany and said, "Captain Holloway, one day I will tell a room full of people what you did." I had asked him not to. I was 29 and hollowed out by grief. I wanted no ceremonies, no interviews, no medals pinned in front of cameras. I wanted the families of the dead to be honored first. He respected that. For years, he respected that. As he began speaking, I listened to his voice and felt something I had locked away begin to move. He spoke about duty. Not the polished version printed on programs, but the private version. Duty when no one claps. Duty when the right thing costs more than people see. Duty when the person who saves the room is not the person standing in front of it. Mark leaned toward me and whispered, "Pay attention. This is how real leaders speak." I turned my head slowly. He did not notice. General Whitmore continued, "Tonight, we honor visible service, but I want us also to remember invisible courage. The quiet professionals, the people who never ask for recognition, the people who carry others through the fire, then step away before anyone can thank them." My pulse changed. I knew that tone. I knew where he was going before he looked up from his notes. "There is someone in this room tonight," he said, "whom I've not seen in many years." The ballroom quieted. General Whitmore scanned the tables. I felt Mark stiffen with anticipation, probably imagining his own name. The general's eyes moved past the officers, the donors, the polished faces. Then they found me. His expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. Recognition, respect, grief, gratitude. "Captain Grace Holloway," he said. Every sound in the room disappeared. My married name was Ellison now, on the seating chart, on Mark's arm, on the place card in front of me. But the name he used was the one I had earned. Captain Grace Holloway. Mark blinked. Patricia turned her head sharply. Robert's mouth opened. I did not move. General Whitmore stepped away from the podium. The room watched as he descended the stage stairs and walked between the tables. One step at a time. Straight toward me. I heard chairs shift. I heard whispers rise and die. I heard Mark inhale. The general stopped in front of our table. Then he did something that no one in that room expected. He stood at attention. And he saluted me. For a moment, I could not breathe. Not because I did not know how to receive a salute. I knew. My body remembered before my mind did. I stood. My hands trembled once, then steadied. I returned the salute. The room remained silent. General Whitmore lowered his hand. "So," he said softly, with the faintest smile, "you did come." My voice did not sound like mine at first. "I came as my husband's guest, sir." His eyes flicked toward Mark, then back to me. "No," he said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. You came as one of the finest officers I ever served with." Mark's face lost color. Patricia whispered, "Officer—" General Whitmore turned slightly, addressing the table and, somehow, the entire ballroom. Captain Holloway led the medical logistics and field evacuation coordination during the Marja corridor incident. When communications broke, she restored contact under fire. When evacuation routes collapsed, she found another path. When I was wounded, she refused to leave 37 personnel behind. A sound moved through the room. Not applause? Shock. The kind of shock that carries shame in it. The general continued. She was awarded the Silver Star for gallantry. She declined every public interview that followed. She asked that attention be given to the wounded and the families of the fallen. Patricia pressed one hand to her chest. Robert stared down at his plate. Mark looked at me as if I had become a stranger in his own house. But I had not changed. He was only seeing the part he had chosen not to know. Major Callahan cleared his throat. I had no idea." General Whitmore looked at him. "Most people did not," he said, "because Captain Holloway never needed a room to know what she was worth." I felt those words hit something deep and bruised. Then the general turned fully to me. "Captain, may I ask your permission to share why I remember your name?" My first instinct was to say no. Old habits, old grief, old guilt. The belief that speaking of survival dishonored those who did not. But then I looked at Mark. My husband, who had spent years shrinking me in public so he could stand taller. I looked at Patricia, who had called him the real officer in the family. I looked at Robert, who had laughed about combat boots. And I realized silence had protected no one except those who benefited from it. "Yes, sir," I said. General Whitmore nodded once. Then he faced the room. "During that operation, I gave an order to pull back because intelligence suggested the corridor was lost. Captain Holloway challenged that order, respectfully, firmly, and with better information than command had at the moment. She had field reports from 2 medics, local coordinates from an Allied unit, and a wounded convoy trapped between 2 broken routes." His voice grew heavier. She was right. I was wrong. You could feel the room listening now. Not politely, but completely. Because she challenged me. 37 people were evacuated. Because she stayed on the radio. My own evacuation team reached me before blood loss took the decision from anyone else. I am standing here tonight, in part, because Grace Holloway understood duty better than rank. My eyes burned. I looked down because if I looked at him too long, I would see the hospital again. White sheets, burned uniforms, men too young to be still. Families waiting outside rooms for news that would divide their lives into before and after. General Whitmore's voice softened. Captain Holloway did not serve a little. She served with distinction. The sentence crossed the ballroom like a verdict. Mark flinched. He knew. I saw it then. He knew enough. Maybe not all of it, but enough to understand that administrative side had been a lie. Enough to understand that he had made a choice. The general turned back to me. "May I escort you to the stage?" My throat tightened. I almost said no again. But then I remembered what Mark had said in the bedroom. "Please remember you're only here as my wife." I stepped away from my chair. "Yes, sir." The walk to the stage felt longer than it should have. People stood as we passed. First one table, then another, then another. Some applauded, some saluted, some simply watched with faces that had lost their certainty. I kept my chin level. On stage, General Whitmore adjusted the microphone. "I plan to speak about leadership tonight," he said. But sometimes leadership is better shown than explained. Then he handed me the microphone. For 1 second, I wanted to refuse. I had built my life around not being the story, around staying quiet, around letting other people call my pain privacy and my service modesty. But then I looked at Mark. My husband stood beside his chair, pale and frozen, as if the truth had betrayed him. I looked at Patricia and Robert, both suddenly silent. And I understood something I should have understood years earlier. Silence can be honorable, but erasure is not. "My name is Grace Holloway Ellison," I said. The microphone carried my voice across the ballroom. I do not speak often about my service, not because I'm ashamed of it, because some memories belong to people who did not come home. I have always tried to handle those memories with care. I paused, but silence can be misunderstood. And sometimes, silence gives other people permission to rewrite a life they never bothered to learn. Mark lowered his eyes. I served 12 years in the United States Army. I served as a medical operations officer and later in field evacuation coordination. I left active duty because my body needed rest and my mind needed quiet, but leaving the uniform did not erase the person who wore it. The room stayed completely still. Tonight, I came here as a wife, but I did not stop being a soldier because someone decided that was more convenient. My hand trembled around the microphone. Only once. Then it stopped. I am proud of my husband when he serves with honor. But I will no longer allow anyone, including him, to make my service smaller so his looks larger. A sound moved through the room. A breath. A recognition. I handed the microphone back. The applause began slowly, then grew until it filled the ballroom like weather. General Whitmore leaned close and said, "Well done, Captain." I whispered, "You could have warned me." He smiled. "You would have stayed home." He was right. When I returned to the table, Mark reached for my hand. "Grace," he said quietly. I had no idea they were going to do that. I looked at his hand until he lowered it. Patricia's voice shook. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" "I did," I said. "Many times, in smaller ways. You preferred the version that made you comfortable." Robert opened his mouth, probably to make another joke. But the younger officer's wife across the table looked directly at him. "Don't," she said. And he did not. For the rest of the dinner, people came to our table. Not to Mark. To me. A retired nurse hugged me and said her son had been one of the men evacuated from the corridor. A young lieutenant asked how I knew when to challenge an order. A donor asked whether I would help advise a new veteran's medical transition program. I answered each person carefully. Mark watched. At first, he looked shocked. Then embarrassed. Then resentful. By dessert, he leaned toward me and whispered, "You made me look like a fool." I turned to him. "No, Mark, I stood still while the truth arrived. What it did to you was not my decision." His jaw tightened. "You could have corrected the general. I earned that rank before I earned your last name." That was when I saw the real wound in him. Not that I had been honored. That I had been honored without his permission. We drove home in silence. The city lights slid across the windshield. Mark gripped the steering wheel too tightly. Finally, he said, "You humiliated me." I looked out the window. "You introduced me as support staff." I said administrative. "You said brief. You said little. You let your mother say you were the real officer in the family." "Because you never talk about it?" Not talking is not an invitation to lie. He had no answer. When we got home, I went straight to the bedroom and pulled the cedar box from under the bed. Mark watched as I opened it. Inside were letters, a unit patch, a folded flag from Lieutenant Maria Torres's memorial service, and the ribbon case I had not opened in years. I lifted the case. The silver star rested inside, quiet as a locked door. Mark stared at it. "Why would you hide that from me?" "I wasn't hiding it from you," I said. "I was waiting for you to care enough to ask." The room went silent. Then he sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly looking less like a decorated officer and more like a man facing the damage he had caused. "I was trying to protect my career," he said. "By making mine disappear?" He did not answer. There it was. The whole marriage in one silence. The next morning, my phone would not stop buzzing. Messages came from officers, veterans, spouses, and people I had not heard from in years. General Whitmore wrote only 4 words. "Proud of you. Call." Mark's phone was not quiet either. By noon, he had received a call from Colonel Reeves. The Regional Advisory Board had delayed its recommendations, and Mark's name was no longer being discussed with the same enthusiasm. No one accused him publicly. No one needed to. Everyone in that ballroom had heard enough. At 2 o'clock, Mark sat across from me at the kitchen table. For once, he did not stand while I sat. "I spoke with Reeves," he said. "He said last night raised questions about my judgment." "It should," I said. He looked down. "I know I hurt you." "No, Mark, you erased me? There is a difference." His eyes reddened. "I thought if people focused on you, they would stop seeing me." That was the first honest thing he had said all day. I looked at the man I'd married, and I finally understood that love does not survive by making one person smaller. "I am not leaving tonight," I said, "but I am leaving the version of this marriage where my silence protects your pride." He nodded slowly. "What do you need from me?" "The truth," I said. "Every time, in every room, if someone asks who I am, you will not say I served a little. You will not call me administrative. You will not let your parents laugh at what they never understood. And if you do, I will correct you before the room moves on." It was not forgiveness. It was a boundary. And for the first time, Mark did not argue with it. 3 weeks later, Patricia invited us to dinner. She looked nervous when she opened the door. "Grace," she said, "I owe you an apology." I waited. She swallowed. "I made you smaller because it made Mark look bigger in my mind. That was cruel. I am sorry." Robert sat at the table, staring at his hands. "I should not have joked about combat boots," he said. "No," I answered. "You should not have." No one laughed. No one changed the subject. And no one asked me to soften the truth for their comfort. That night, Mark introduced me to a family friend who stopped by unexpectedly. "This is my wife," he said, then paused. I turned toward him. He took a breath. "Captain Grace Holloway Ellison, retired Army, medical operations and evacuation coordination." His voice shook, but he said it. That did not fix everything. But truth, spoken late, is still better than a lie repeated forever. 2 months after the gala, General Whitmore asked me to help advise a new veterans medical transition program. I almost said no. Then I remembered the young lieutenant at the dinner writing my words on a napkin. When the facts are clearer than the fear. So I said yes. The first time I walked into that conference room, I wore a charcoal blazer and the small silver star pin I had kept hidden for years. Not to impress anyone, not to prove anything. To remind myself that humility was not the same as erasure. I spoke about lost records, delayed care, families who did not understand trauma, and veterans who were praised in public but ignored in private. When I finished, the room was silent. Then an older medic stood. "Captain," he said, "thank you for saying what some of us never could." That was when I understood what General Whitmore had really done that night. He had not rescued me. He had handed me back my own voice. A year later, I returned to the Grand Meridian Hotel as the keynote speaker. This time, my invitation had my name on it. Not Mrs. Mark Ellison. Captain Grace Holloway Ellison. Before I stepped on stage, I saw Mark standing near the back of the ballroom. He did not wave me over. He did not try to attach himself to my moment. He simply placed his hand over his heart and nodded. It was not perfect, but it was respect. When I walked to the microphone, General Whitmore stood in the front row. Then others stood too. Veterans, spouses, officers, people who understood that some battles continue long after the uniform is folded away. I looked out at them and said, "Your silence may be honorable, but your erasure is not required." The applause that followed did not feel like noise. It felt like release. Later that night, I opened the cedar box again. I placed the gala program inside, beside the letters, the unit patch, and the medal I had hidden for too long. For years, that box had felt like a grave. Now it felt like an archive. A record of a woman who had served, survived, stayed quiet, and finally decided that peace did not mean disappearing. My husband once told me I was only there as his wife. But that night, a general stood in front of everyone and saluted the woman I had been all along. And from that moment forward, no one in my life ever got to call my service little again.